Have you ever wondered how one tiny, almost foolish act of kindness could flip your entire life upside down? How a simple moment, a decision made in the cold, with nothing left to give, could ripple through time and change everything. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about fate, about how a single $10 bill became a thread that stitched together two broken lives in the most unexpected way. Picture this. It's a cold, gray March morning. The kind where the rain doesn't fall in sheets but lingers in the air like a heavy fog, chilling you right down to the bone. The train station is nearly empty, quiet except for the hiss of arriving trains and the occasional shuffle of footsteps on wet pavement. And there, standing alone beneath the flickering fluorescent lights, is Emily, a young woman barely holding herself together. Her coat is too thin, her shoes are soaked, and in her pocket is a crumpled $10 bill. Not much, but it's all she has left in the world. She's on her way to a job interview. Her last shot at crawling out of the pit her life has become. But then, just when she thinks the day couldn't get any heavier, a stranger appears. Soaked to the skin, beard unkempt, eyes hollow yet quietly desperate. He stops her with a hesitant, almost broken voice. "Please, I just need $10 to get home. I swear I'll pay you back." Emily's heart pounds. That $10 is all she has between her and total emptiness. She could walk away. Should walk away. Who helps a stranger at a train station these days? But something in his eyes, a sadness, a shame, makes her pause. And in that split second, she makes a choice that will change everything. She reaches into her coat, pulls out her last $10 bill, and hands it to him. No questions, no promises, just blind, reckless trust. She doesn't know it yet, but that tiny gesture, the one that left her with nothing, will spark a chain of events she never could have imagined. Because that stranger, he wasn't just anyone. And when fate circles back around, it won't just return her kindness. It will rewrite her entire life. The rain hadn't let up. It fell in a constant, whispering drizzle that slicked the train platform and turned every step into a cold, wet gamble. Emily stood there, her fingers numb despite being shoved deep into her coat pockets. The gray sky pressed low, heavy like the weight she'd been carrying for months. Around her, the world moved on in quiet indifference. Commuters buried in their scarves, eyes glued to their phones, faces turned away from the cold and from each other. She glanced up at the schedule board, the numbers flickering like a heartbeat. One train left, hers. A chance, maybe her last, to turn her life around. And then, "Excuse me." The voice was soft, almost fragile, and if it weren't for the emptiness of the station, she might have missed it altogether. She turned, startled, and there he was, a man who looked more like a shadow than a person. Rain clung to his shoulders, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes the color of a fading storm. He looked broken in a way that wasn't just about being wet or cold. "I'm sorry," he stammered. I had my wallet stolen. I just need $10 to get home. Please, I swear I'll pay you back." Emily froze, her heart twisted in her chest. It would have been so easy to walk away, pretend she hadn't heard him, like everyone else probably had. And honestly, she should have. She didn't have money to spare, not a dime. That crumpled $10 in her pocket, it was supposed to be her safety net after the interview, a cheap meal, a cup of coffee, something to remind her she wasn't completely empty. But in that moment, standing there beneath the hum of the platform lights, the weight of the rain pressing down on both of them, she saw something in his eyes. Not a con, not a scheme, just sheer exhaustion, shame, a kind of loneliness that mirrored her own. Her fingers brushed against a bill inside her pocket, her mind screaming to keep it, but her heart louder, whispering, "Help him." So she did, and as a man's hand closed around that small, damp bill, thanking her with a voice cracking at the edges, neither of them knew that this brief, improbable encounter would soon come back around and flip both their lives upside down. The train screeched into the station like an impatient beast, steam hissing around the platform as passengers shuffled forward, their faces blank, their eyes elsewhere. Emily stood frozen, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She watched as the man, the stranger she had just handed her last $10 to, disappeared into the crowd without so much as a name. Just like that, he was gone. For a second, she stood there gripping the empty pocket of her coat. The space where her last hope had lived now cold and hollow. What had she just done? She didn't know his name, where he was from, if he was even telling the truth. All she had was a memory of how he'd looked at her, as if she was the first person in the world who hadn't turned away. The loudspeaker above her crackled, snapping her back to reality. Her train was next. Emily boarded in a daze, the dampness of her coat clinging to her skin. She sank into a window seat, her fingers trembling, her stomach twisted in knots. Not from hunger this time, but from the nagging fear that she had just made the dumbest decision of her life. As the train pulled away from the platform, the city slipping past in gray blurs, Emily leaned her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. That man's face wouldn't leave her. The rain in his eyes, the crack in his voice, the way he had looked almost embarrassed to need help. A million doubts raced through her head. Was he lying? Would he even make it home? Had she just thrown away her last shot at survival for nothing? She didn't know. All she knew was that, for the first time in a long time, she hadn't ignored someone else's pain. And somehow, that felt like the only thing tethering her to who she used to be before everything had fallen apart. The train rolled on, the rain blurring the world outside, and Emily whispered quietly to herself, "Maybe I was a fool, but at least, just for a second, I wasn't invisible." What she didn't know was that this one foolish act of compassion had already set something in motion, something far bigger than she could ever imagine. The city felt heavier that morning, like it was pressing down on her shoulders with every step she took. The rain hadn't stopped. It dripped from the corners of buildings, pooled in cracks along the sidewalk, and clung to Emily's clothes like the weight of every mistake she'd ever made. Her stomach growled as she stood outside the tall office building, her shoes squishing with every step. She glanced at the glass doors, at the polished people walking in with purpose. She was supposed to be one of them today. This interview was her last shot, a chance to claw her way out of the spiral she'd been trapped in for months. But she was 20 minutes late. The bus had required exact change. She hadn't had it. She'd walked, cutting through unfamiliar streets, wet socks blistering her heels, the cold gnawing at her bones. And when she finally reached the receptionist's desk, shivering, breathless, and hopeful, the woman didn't even look up. "I'm sorry. The interviewer had another meeting. You'll have to reschedule." Emily tried to explain, offered to wait, but the woman's eyes slid right past her, already focused back on her screen. By the time Emily stepped back onto the street, the rain felt colder than before. That $10, that stupid, reckless $10 she had handed to a stranger, haunted her like a ghost. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. She'd gambled everything on that man's honesty and lost. The walk home felt longer than ever, each step heavier. When she reached her door, the hallway light flickering above her like a dying star, she found the landlord waiting. "Rent was due 3 days ago." "I know, I'm trying." "You said that last week." No arguments, no sympathy. By nightfall, her few belongings were stuffed into a threadbare backpack. 2 shirts, a cracked phone, an old photo of her mother. The only things left in the world that belonged to her. That night, she curled up in a corner of the 24-hour library, the hum of fluorescent lights above her, the cold creeping into her bones. She thought about the man at the station, his face, his eyes, and quietly, in the darkness, she wondered if that moment of kindness had been her undoing, or the start of something she couldn't yet see. The days that followed weren't really days at all. They bled into one another like smudged ink on damp paper, gray, cold, forgettable. Emily moved like a ghost through the city, her backpack clutched tightly against her chest, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Each night, the search for a place to sleep became harder. The library had closed for a holiday. The shelters were full. The park benches were cold and unforgiving, the metal biting into her skin like sharp teeth. She tried to disappear, pulling her coat tighter, shrinking smaller, praying no one would notice her. But the world noticed in the worst ways. One evening, as the rain let up and the city lights flickered on like stars she couldn't reach, A group of teenagers passed by. They laughed too loud, tossed an empty soda can at her feet, and one of them muttered under his breath, "Get a job." They kept walking, leaving Emily frozen, the sting of their words cutting deep in the cold ever could. That night, she found herself curled up beneath the awning of a bus shelter, the wind howling around her. She pulled her knees to her chest and let the tears come. Not loud, not messy, but silent, streaming down her face like the rain that had never really stopped. She missed her mother's voice. She missed feeling safe. She missed a version of herself who had believed things could still get better. The next morning, the sun rose without warmth. Emily stood up, stiff and sore, brushing the damp from her clothes. She had hit bottom, and there was nothing left to lose. But just when she thought the world had turned its back for good, a stranger appeared. An older woman, small, graceful, with a wool shawl around her shoulders. She stopped in front of Emily, eyes kind but firm. "You look hungry," the woman said softly. Emily wanted to laugh, to scream, to pretend she didn't need anyone. But instead, she nodded. The woman handed her a brown paper bag. Inside, a simple sandwich, fresh bread, ham, cheese, a smear of mustard. "I bring extra every morning," she said, "in case I meet someone who needs it." Emily didn't know it yet, but this was the second time a stranger's kindness would change everything. The woman's name was Ruth, though Emily wouldn't learn that until later. That day in the park, Ruth simply sat beside her, without judgment, without pity, as if they'd known each other for years. She didn't ask questions. She didn't press for Emily's story. She just placed that brown paper bag gently on the bench between them, like it wasn't just a sandwich, but an offering, a lifeline. At first, Emily resisted. She shook her head, mumbled something about being fine, even though the ache in her stomach said otherwise. She was tired of people looking at her like she was broken, like she didn't belong. But Ruth didn't flinch. She smiled, soft and knowing. "Is your pride bigger than your hunger?" she asked. Those words hit harder than any insult, any rejection. Emily stared at the sandwich like it might disappear if she touched it. But eventually, quietly, almost shamefully, she reached out and took it. The first bite made her eyes sting. Not because of the mustard, but because it had been so long since anyone had offered her something without expecting anything in return. When she finally looked up, Ruth was already standing, adjusting the shawl over her thin shoulders. "There's a soup kitchen on Monroe Street," she said, voice gentle but firm. "They serve lunch every day, but they're always short on help. Ask for Carol. Tell her Ruth sent you." Then, without waiting for a thank you, Ruth walked away, her steps light, almost as if she carried no weight at all. Emily sat there, staring at the half-eaten sandwich in her lap, the name Carol echoing in her mind like a faint melody she couldn't quite place. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet woman, this strange in the park, had just cracked open a door Emily thought had long been sealed shut. It wasn't the sandwich. It wasn't even the soup kitchen. It was a message behind it. The first spark of an idea she hadn't dared to believe in for months. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible after all. The next day, Emily stood outside a modest, worn-down brick building on Monroe Street. A peeling wooden sign above the door read, "Hope Table Soup Kitchen." The smell of baked bread and vegetable soup drifted through the cracks of the door, warm and inviting. A stark contrast to the cold world outside. For a long moment, she hesitated. What was she even doing here? She didn't belong. She wasn't like them, the people inside who had jobs, who had purpose, who belonged somewhere. But then she remembered Ruth's voice. Ask for Carol. So she pushed the door open. Inside, the room buzzed with noise, chatter, laughter, the clatter of bowls and trays. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't clean, but it felt alive. A woman with rolled-up sleeves, a clipboard in her hand, and tired eyes scanning the room. Spotted her almost immediately. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone brisk but not unkind. Emily swallowed. "Ruth sent me," she said quietly. "She said you might need help." That was all it took. Carol's face softened instantly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Ruth's got an eye for people who need a second chance," she said. "You willing to work?" Emily nodded before she could even think. then grab an apron. The hours blurred after that. She chopped vegetables until her fingers ached, wiped down tables, poured steaming bowls of soup into chipped dishes. She moved fast, her body on autopilot, but her heart started to wake up again. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't invisible. People smiled at her, said thank you, told her stories about their lives, their losses, their hopes, their pain. She realized they weren't so different from her. They had fallen, just like she had. But here inside these four faded walls, they still showed up, still fought, still hoped. When the last table was wiped down and the kitchen finally quieted, Carol handed her a small envelope. Just a little something. She said, "You've earned it." Inside, $20. A bus pass. A meal. But more than that, recognition. Trust. A sliver of dignity. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily didn't fall asleep feeling invisible. She fell asleep feeling seen. Days turned into weeks, and little by little, Emily began to piece herself back together, one humble shift at a time. She kept showing up at Hope Table, even on days she didn't have to. Not because she needed a meal, though they always offered her one. Not because of the stipend, though every dollar still mattered. She came because, for the first time in a long time, she felt useful. Every morning, she tied on that old apron and walked to the kitchen door with a sense of purpose tucked quietly in her chest. She learned how to peel potatoes faster than anyone else, how to stack clean bowls without making a sound, how to spot who needed an extra helping of soup or who just needed a warm smile to get them through the day. More importantly, she learned people's names, their stories. The man who told bad jokes while waiting in line, the elderly woman who brought flowers every Wednesday, the single mother who cried quietly over a bowl because life had been too heavy that week. Emily didn't just serve them food. She listened, and in listening, she healed. It wasn't a grand, dramatic recovery. There were no miracle paychecks, no overnight transformations. It was slow, quiet work, the kind that stitched your soul back together when you weren't looking. One evening, after the kitchen closed and the floors were mopped clean, Carol walked up beside her and handed her another envelope. "You've been showing up for everyone else," she said softly. "It's about time someone showed up for you." Inside was a bus pass, enough for the week, and a handwritten note. "You matter." Emily sat on the curb outside the soup kitchen that night, watching the sky fade from gold to purple, the city softening in the glow of streetlights. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was falling anymore. She was still poor, still uncertain, but she wasn't broken. Her rag still in hand, Emily stood frozen as the man's gaze scanned the room, searching. And when his eyes landed on her, somewhere deep inside, the tiniest spark had been lit, and she held on to it like a secret, like a fragile, precious thing that might one day become something bigger. What she didn't know was that the universe was already moving pieces into place. The stranger from the train station, the man who had disappeared into the rain, was about to return. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon at the soup kitchen. The lunch rush had died down, the chatter and clatter replaced by the soft hum of Carol humming an old tune as she dried dishes. Emily stood near the back, wiping down tables like she always did, her apron stained but her heart light. She was humming, too, almost without realizing it. A tune she couldn't quite place, but one that made her chest feel warm. Then the door chimed. Emily glanced up, expecting another regular, another tired face looking for a warm meal. But what she saw made her breath catch. A man had stepped inside, shaking the rain off his dark tailored coat. His shoes were polished, his hair neatly combed, and everything about him looked out of place in this part of town. Too clean, too sharp, too deliberate. But it wasn't the coat or the shoes that stopped her cold. It was his eyes. Blue, calm, familiar. He stopped just for a moment, but it felt like the entire world paused with him. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Slowly, almost cautiously, he walked toward her. "Hello," he said, his voice warmer than she remembered. Steady now. "Do you recognize me?" Emily stared, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. And then it clicked. The rain, the train station, the crumpled $10 bill slipping from her fingers into his hand. You. The word escaped her lips in a breathless whisper. He nodded. David Carter, he said quietly, you gave me your last $10 when I had nothing. I've been looking for you ever since. Emily felt her knees wobble beneath her. The stranger she thought she'd never see again, the man she had nearly forgotten, except in quiet moment alone at night, was standing here, clean-cut, confident, successful. But why? Why here? Before she could even find the words, he added softly, I promised I'd pay you back. But I came here for something more. What Emily didn't know in that moment was that the stranger she had saved wasn't just a man in need. He was a millionaire, and he was about to change her life. Emily sat stiffly across from him, her apron still tied around her waist, her fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of chamomile tea. The little cafe was warm, the low hum of soft jazz filling the space. But inside her, it felt like the whole world had gone eerily still. She kept glancing at him, tried to reconcile the man sitting in front of her with the shivering, broken stranger she met on that rainy train platform. David Carter. The name didn't mean much to her at first, until he reached into his coat and slid a sleek black business card across the table. David Carter, CEO, Nova's Part Technologies, founder, the Carter Foundation. Emily blinked, her lips parting, but no words came out. She had heard of Nova's Park. Everyone had. They were on the news, building cutting-edge learning software for underfunded schools, helping communities that the world had long forgotten. But that day at the station, David leaned back in his chair, smiling quietly. I was doing something stupid, he admitted. My team and I run initiatives to understand homelessness, to build better systems for people falling through the cracks. I wanted to see it for myself. So I went undercover. No wallet, no name, no safety net. He paused, stirring his coffee. But I didn't plan on getting my pocket picked on the first day. Emily let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. So you really were stranded? I was. His eyes softened, that smile fading into something more vulnerable. And everyone I asked turned me away. Everyone except you. Emily stared at the table, her heart pounding wildly. I didn't do anything special, she murmured. I just gave you what I had. That's why it mattered, he said gently. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything in return. You gave me everything you had and walked away. He leaned forward then, voice quieter but steady. That moment never left me. You saved me when you had nothing to give. The truth of it settled between them like a secret finally spoken aloud. Emily's mind spun, trying to piece together how the man she had pitied that day was now sitting here, polished and powerful, telling her he hadn't forgotten her face. And then, softly like an afterthought, I want to offer you something, David said. A chance to change your life the way you changed mine. Emily sat frozen, her hands tightening around her mug, like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. She'd spent months fighting to survive. On park benches, in library corners, behind the counter at the soup kitchen, never once imagining that the man she'd given her last $10 to would return like this, clean-shaven, confident, and offering her what exactly? David reached into his coat once more, and this time he pulled out something small, a crisp, untouched $10 bill. I brought this, he said quietly, sliding across the table toward her, to pay you back. Emily stared at the bill, her throat tightening. It looked surreal, sitting there between them like a bridge back to the person she used to be, the desperate girl in the rain who had handed it over without knowing if she'd ever eat again. But before she could speak, David added softly, That's not the real reason I'm here. He leaned forward then, his voice dropping into something warm and careful, like he knew he was about to turn her entire world upside down. I want you to work with us, he said, at the Carter Foundation. Emily blinked, her breath catching in her chest. Me? She whispered, shaking her head. I don't even have a degree. I don't have a resume. I don't even have an address. But David just smiled, calm, sure, like he already knew her answer. We've hired people with MBAs, he said. and people who've lived in tents. What matters isn't a piece of paper. It's who you are. He looked at her then, not like a charity case, not like someone who needed saving, but like someone who had value, like someone who could change the world. You showed more heart, more integrity than most of the people I know, he continued. I want you to be part of something bigger, to help build programs that lift people up. Because you've been where they are. You get it. For a long moment, Emily couldn't speak. The girl who once stood on a freezing platform, alone and invisible, was now being offered a place to belong, a chance to rebuild not just her life, but the lives of others like her. David's voice softened one last time. All you have to do is say yes. For a long, heavy moment, Emily didn't answer. The cafe around her faded. The soft jazz, the clink of dishes, the chatter at the next table, it all disappeared beneath the pounding of her heart. It felt surreal, impossible, like she had somehow stepped into someone else's life. How could a girl who had slept on park benches, who'd been laughed at, overlooked, forgotten, now be sitting across from a man who wanted to give her a future? David watched her quietly, patiently, as if he understood she needed to let the weight of it sink in. Finally, she swallowed hard and lifted her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. One small word, but it cracked something wide open inside her. David smiled. Not the polished, corporate smile he probably gave at board meetings, but something softer, real. "Good," he said, "because I wasn't going to leave without your yes." From that moment on, everything began to change. Her first day at the Carter Foundation felt like stepping into a different universe. The headquarters wasn't some cold, glass skyscraper. It was a renovated brick warehouse buzzing with life. Young people bustled between desks, their voices filled with purpose. The walls were covered in photos, quotes, and handwritten notes from people whose lives the foundation had touched. David didn't introduce her as someone who had once been homeless. He introduced her as someone who had something to offer, someone who mattered. That alone changed everything. Emily threw herself into the work. She spent her days learning about grant writing, community outreach, project design. She shadowed coordinators who worked in shelters, food banks, recovery centers. She asked questions, took notes, stayed late, and listened. Slowly, the pieces of her broken confidence began to stitch back together. Each morning, she stood a little taller. Each night, she fell asleep with a sense of purpose buzzing beneath her ribs. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't fighting to survive. She was fighting to build something. And every now and then, when she caught David's gaze across the room, that same soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips, she realized something else. She wasn't just rebuilding her life. She was stepping into the life she was always meant to live. Weeks turned into months, and with every passing day, Emily felt herself changing. Not just surviving anymore, but growing, dreaming, leading. One afternoon, David handed her a slim folder, a spark of something unspoken in his eyes. "You've been showing up for everyone else," he said, his voice calm but full of meaning. "It's time you designed something of your own." Inside the folder was a blank project proposal with her name printed neatly at the top. A blank page, a fresh start. For a long time, Emily just stared at it, her fingers trembling slightly. She had spent so long scraping by. She had almost forgotten how to dream, but when she closed her eyes, she saw it clearly. She saw the cold benches in the park, the people who couldn't make it to fixed shelters because they were too scared, too ashamed, too broken. She remembered the rain, the hunger, the weight of feeling invisible. And that night, sitting at her tiny kitchen table, Emily began to write. Her idea was simple but powerful: a mobile soup kitchen, a van that would travel to forgotten corners of the city, bringing not just hot meals, but human connection, dignity, hope, a place where no one had to feel like an outsider. She called it the Open Hands Project. When she handed the proposal back to David weeks later, she half expected him to laugh, to tell her it was too ambitious, too expensive, too much. But instead, he smiled and said 2 words: "Let's build it." The foundation approved the plan without hesitation. They funded the first van, hired a small team, and trusted her to lead. The first time Emily saw the finished van, painted sky blue, the words "Open Hands Project" written across the side in soft, welcoming letters, She stood in the parking lot and cried. It wasn't about the van. It was about everything it represented. The girl who once gave away her last $10 with nothing left to her name was now the woman leading a mission to feed thousands. Her first night on the road, she parked beneath the same statue where she used to sleep, beneath the cold stars of a city that had once forgotten her. And that night, as she handed out bowls of warm soup, she realized she hadn't just found her purpose. She had become someone else's lifeline. It had been almost a year since that cold, rainy day at the train station. Almost a year since Emily had handed her last $10 to a stranger and unknowingly rewritten her fate. The Open Hands Project had grown faster than she ever imagined. Every night, the van rolled through forgotten streets, serving hot meals and smiles, offering a moment of dignity to those who felt invisible. And every night, Emily's heart grew lighter, fuller. But she never expected what would happen one quiet Saturday afternoon. They had just wrapped up a community luncheon at the park. The air was warm, soft with the smell of spring, and volunteers were packing up tables when Emily spotted a figure sitting alone on a bench beneath the trees. A familiar figure. Her breath caught. It was Ruth, the woman who, all those months ago, had handed her a simple sandwich in the park when she thought no one saw her. Without thinking, Emily walked over, her throat tight, her chest full. "I've thought about you every day since," she said quietly, sitting beside her. "You saved me." Ruth smiled, that same gentle, knowing smile she had given her in the park. "All I did was feed a hungry girl." They sat there in the shade, catching up like old friends who'd somehow always known each other. Ruth listened patiently as Emily told her everything. The soup kitchen, David, the foundation, the mobile van now changing lives. And then, just as Emily was about to thank her again, Ruth chuckled softly and reached out to pat her hand. "I always hoped you'd find your way to David," she said, almost like she was sharing a secret. Emily blinked, confused. "You know him?" Ruth's eyes twinkled with something warm and mischievous. "I should," she said. "He's my son." The words hit Emily like a wave, her breath catching in her throat. All this time, the woman who gave her a sandwich in the park, the woman who quietly nudged her toward the soup kitchen, who believed in her when no one else did, was David's mother. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It had been kindness, woven quietly behind the scenes, connecting them long before either of them knew. And in that moment, Emily finally understood. Her story had never been about falling. It had always been about finding her way home. After that day in the park, something shifted inside Emily, not just in her heart, but in how she saw the threads of her life weaving together. She started noticing the way David's eyes lingered a little longer when he looked at her, the way his voice softened when he asked about her day, the way he showed up, not in grand, flashy ways, but in the small, quiet spaces where most people forget to show up. Their connection wasn't loud or fast. It grew in the silences, in the late nights after community events when they'd walk side by side, their conversations drifting from project deadlines to childhood memories to what scared them most. He never treated her like she was broken, never once reminded her of who she used to be. Instead, he listened, really listened. He saw her in a way that made her feel safe, seen, and slowly, unbelievably loved. One night, after a long shift serving meals, they stood together by the van, the city lights flickering like scattered stars. The air was cool but not cold, and Emily's heart felt light in a way she couldn't quite explain. "You know," David said, leaning casually against the van, "when I met you, I thought you were the one saving me." Emily smiled, brushing her hair back, her cheeks warm. "Turns out we saved each other." It wasn't a love story written in fireworks or fairy tales. It was built in the quiet, over coffee cups shared between meetings, over crumpled blueprints for new outreach programs, over the knowledge that both of them had fallen once and stood back up together. They weren't perfect, but they understood what it meant to be broken. And that understanding became the strongest kind of love. One afternoon, as they sat side by side on the foundation's rooftop garden, watching the city pulse below, David reached over without a word and laced his fingers through hers. No promises, No declarations. Just two people who had once been strangers in the rain, now building a future, quietly, hand in hand. And even though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew the story that had started with $10 wasn't just about survival anymore. It had quietly, beautifully become about love. Spring had arrived in the city, soft and green, the streets buzzing with new life. Emily walked alongside David to the community garden she had helped build, the sound of laughter floating in the air, volunteers tending to seedlings, children chasing each other between rows of sprouting vegetables. The garden had become a reflection of everything she'd fought for, proof that something beautiful could grow even in broken places. But David had been quiet all afternoon. His usual lightness, that easy smile he always gave her, had been replaced by something heavier, thoughtful, distant. When they reached the far end of the garden, beneath the branches of a budding magnolia tree, he finally spoke. "I've been offered a new opportunity," he said softly, his fingers brushing against the leaves as he spoke. "They want me to lead a new branch of the foundation in New York." Emily felt her heart pause, her breath catching in her throat. New York, a city full of possibilities, but also far away. Before she could speak, David turned to her, his eyes steady. "But I told them I wouldn't go unless I made you the same offer." Her eyes widened. "You want to go with you?" "I do." His voice was quiet but sure. "To help lead the next phase of Open Hands. To reach more people. To keep building what we started together." The weight of it settled on her chest. The invitation, the future, the fork in the road. Emily looked around the garden, the place that had become home, the people she'd fought to serve, the roots she'd planted here. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love what we built here. These people, they were the first to believe in me." David nodded slowly, without disappointment, only understanding. "I thought you might feel that way." They sat together on the old wooden bench beneath the tree, letting the quiet settle between them. "Maybe this is a part where the road splits," she said softly. David glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe," he replied, "but only in geography, never in heart." And in that moment, Emily knew something with absolute certainty. No matter where life took them next, their story wasn't ending. It was simply changing course. A year passed like the turning of a page. The city had changed, or maybe Emily had. The streets no longer felt cold or unforgiving. They felt alive, filled with faces and stories and hope. The Open Hands Project had become something far bigger than she ever dreamed. The mobile kitchen now served over 2,000 meals a week. But it wasn't just about food. It was about dignity, connection, human kindness passed from one hand to another. And at the heart of it all was Emily. On the anniversary of the project's founding, the team organized a celebration. There were balloons taped to the soup van, a banner that read 1 year of Open Hands, and strings of photos stretched across the room. Captured smiles, shared meals, lives changed. Emily arrived late, fresh from a meeting with city officials about expanding the program. She stepped inside, scanning the crowd of volunteers, old friends, and the faces of people who had once stood in line for a bowl of soup, but now stood taller, prouder. Then she saw him, David. He stood by the serving table, dressed simply but smiling like the entire room didn't exist except for her. In his hand, he held a small bouquet of wildflowers and something else tucked discreetly in his jacket pocket. The noise around her faded. The world grew still. As he walked toward her, every moment, every cold night, every tear, every meal shared, seemed to lead to this. "Hi," he said softly, like it was the first time all over again. Emily laughed, the sound breaking through the lump in her throat. "You came back." "I told you I would," he replied. And then, as the room quieted like it knew something bigger was about to happen, David reached into his jacket. First, he pulled out a crisp $10 bill, unfolded, untouched. "I've carried this with me for a year," he said. "Not because I needed to repay you, but because I needed to remember the moment everything changed." Then he pulled out a small velvet box, opened it. Inside, a simple, elegant ring. "You gave me something no amount of money could buy." David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Faith when I had nothing. Let me spend the rest of my life proving you were right." Emily's breath caught. The girl who once gave away her last $10 had become the woman standing at the center of a miracle. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking, and the room erupted in applause. That night, long after the applause had faded and the last guest had left, Emily stood beneath the soft glow of the string lights strung across the rooftop garden. The same place where a year ago, she and David had first sat quietly dreaming about what could be. In her hands, she held that crisp $10 bill one last time. It felt weightless now, like a relic from a different life. She smiled quietly, tears prickling her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming beauty of how far she'd come. Beside her, David stood close, his hand warm in hers. The city stretched out below them, buzzing with life. "It's funny, isn't it?" she said softly, staring at the bill. "How something so small can change everything." David squeezed her hand gently, his voice barely louder than the wind. "A little kindness can ripple further than we ever imagined." And it was true, that single act. The moment she handed her last $10 to a stranger on a rainy morning, thinking she'd lost everything, had become a thread that stitched her life back together. A thread that stretched from a cold train station to a soup kitchen, to a mobile van serving thousands, to a rooftop under the stars, beside the man she loved. Her story wasn't perfect. It was messy, painful, full of struggle and heartbreak. But in the end, it was never about falling apart. It was about how far a person can rise when anyone believes in them. As the wind carried the sound of laughter from below, Emily folded the bill carefully and tucked it away. Not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to remember. To remember that sometimes the smallest, most ordinary act of kindness are the ones that change everything. And to anyone listening, anyone who ever wondered if they mattered, if their story mattered, this was proof. A stranger's kindness, a sandwich in the park, a $10 bill. All it takes is one small act of compassion to set a miracle in motion. Because the truth is, we're all just one moment away from changing someone's life, or having ours change forever. The celebrations swirl around them like a dream. Music, laughter, voices blending into a joyful hum. But for Emily, everything had slowed to a heartbeat. Because across the room, moving to the crowd like he belonged nowhere else but here, was David, his eyes locked on hers, a small, knowing smile on his lips. He was holding something, a bouquet of wildflowers, and something else tucked discreetly in his jacket pocket. Emily's pulse hammered in her chest as he reached her, the noise around them falling away like static, fading into silence. "Hi," he said softly, his voice a thread pulling her back to the moment everything had begun. "You came back," she breathed, her throat tight with a thousand unsaid things. "I told you I would." And then, with the whole room unknowingly holding its breath, David reached into his jacket and pulled out something she hadn't seen in over a year. A crisp $10 bill, unfolded, untouched. He held out gently, like it was the most precious thing in the world. "I've carried this with me every day," he said, his voice low, shaking slightly. "Not because I needed to repay you, but because I needed to remember. That moment, that kindness, that split second when someone looked at me, not for what I had, but for who I was." Emily stared at the bill, her eyes burning, her heart thudding against her ribs. And then, before she could even catch her breath, he reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small velvet box. The air shifted. The entire room seemed to still, as if the world itself was holding its breath alongside her. David opened the box slowly, revealing a simple, elegant ring that shimmered beneath the soft lights. "You gave me something I could never repay," he said, his voice breaking now. "You gave me faith when I had nothing to show for myself. Let me spend the rest of my life proving you were right." Tears blurred Emily's vision as she stared at the man standing in front of her. Not the stranger she'd met in the rain, but the man who had quietly, patiently become her safe place. The girl who had once given away her last $10 had just been handed a forever she never thought she deserved. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Yes." And in that instant, Her entire life folded beautifully back into itself, like the bill he had carried all this time. And so, my friends, that's how a single crumpled $10 bill became the thread that stitched two broken lives back together. A simple, almost foolish act of kindness that rippled across time and changed not just one destiny, but many. Emily's story isn't just about luck. It's not about chance. It's about what happens when we choose to see someone, when we choose compassion over fear, generosity over suspicion. She didn't know that the stranger standing in front of her that rainy morning was a millionaire. She didn't give him her last $10 because she expected something in return. She gave it because she understood what it felt like to be invisible, to need help and have no one stop. And in doing so, she set something powerful in motion, a reminder that sometimes the tiniest spark of kindness is all it takes to light up the darkest night. The lesson here is simple but profound. You never know who you're helping when you choose to be kind. You never know when your small act of compassion will come back around and change your life in ways you could never imagine. So, the next time you see someone struggling, someone overlooked, someone who looks like the world has forgotten them, remember this story. Because one moment, one decision, one $10 bill can be the beginning of a miracle. Sparkles, thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this beautiful and unforgettable journey. If Emily's story touched your heart, if it made you smile, made you cry, made you believe again in the quiet power of kindness, then I invite you to become part of our storytelling family. Backhand index pointing right. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another soul-stirring story. And while you're here, give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and leave me a comment below. Tell me, what would you do if you were in Emily's shoes? Your engagement means the world to me. This is Mr. Michael Stories, where every story reminds us that goodness still exists and that your story matters too. Until next time, my friends, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never underestimate the power of a small act of kindness.